Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to welcome you to the fourth lecture in the New England Symposium focused on the North and the Civil War, which was held at the Massachusetts School of Law in October of 2003. Our next speaker is one of the true intellectuals of the Civil War community. He was part of the Dynamic Three, Mark Grimsley, Steve Woodworth, and he is Brooks Sympson. Brooks at the time, and still is, a professor of history at Arizona State University in Tempe. And Brooks is the author of the definitive biography. It's a wartime biography of U.S. Grant entitled A Triumph Over Adversity, which Bars believes is the best biography ever written of Grant, and I agree. Recently, Ron Chernow wrote a biography of Grant that is getting him a lot of kudos because of his other large biographies, but Chernow really doesn't tell you much new about Grant in wartime, whereas his work on Grant's post-war presidency and his time as Secretary of War, I think, are worth the cost of Chernow's book alone. Sympson's first book, his doctoral dissertation, I believe, was on Grant, and it produced a book known as "Let Us Have Peace." He also, his first wife, Jean Berlin, and he corroborated on a massive book of the selected correspondence of William Tecumseh Sherman, which, when combined with a book on Sherman's correspondence with his brother, Senator Sherman, really gives you a great insight into the intellectual Sherman and how he interfaces with the pragmatic Grant and the politicians and politics of the period. We'll talk about that later in this symposium. But for right now, what Brooks wanted to do was he wanted to delve into the political civilian elements of the North and the Civil War. And so his first talk in this symposium is the Civil War, Home Front, Battlefront, which deals with the relations in the North during the Civil War. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Brooks Sympson. And he has to include many of our next speakers' works at a time when it's been so easy for people to pile on and write books about Gettysburg and other battles that have been written about item and item. Brooks Sympson has taken a different road and has put out what Ed Bars has stated is simply the finest biography he's ever read of a Civil War figure, in talking about Triumph Over Adversity, the book on Grant. And even more important than that, I think, and certainly almost ironically and anticlimactically to that, he has edited a select set of the letters of William Tecumseh Sherman, and probably has one of the most insightful looks at Sherman and his view of war and his view of life and how those things come together. So it's always a real pleasure to bring Brooks to one of these programs, because he always lends something new to our understanding and insight into leadership and northern views of the war. So please join me in welcoming Brooks Sympson.
I'm grateful to be here, welcoming all of you to Andover. I noticed that Herman was talking this morning about what ifs, and of course I have some what ifs that I always reflect upon, and I'm glad they didn't happen. What if Mike Torres had pitched Bucky Dent outside? What if John McNamara had put Dave Stapleton in for Bill Buckner? And what if Bob Stanley had not played in either the 78 playoff game or the 86 World Series Game 6. And so on the advice of others, I thought I'd come properly dressed today. And
You're brave.
I'm not a brave, I'm a Yankee. I know. Well, we'll see what happens this afternoon, but I was certainly glad the Yankees won Game 2. I dreaded coming up here and watching the Yankees get swept altogether. But I do see the Boston Red Sox as the 20th century lost cause. And perhaps history will be different in this millennia, but who knows. Well, this afternoon I'm going to speak about the home front and the battlefront in terms of the North, not as Jackie did about the South and South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, but rather about the North. And I'd like to start off by reminding you of a story that I'm sure many have heard many times. And this event took place early in 1863 along the Mississippi-Arkansas border. Two generals were poring over a map discussing options on what to do to take the Confederate citadel at Vicksburg, Mississippi. And one of them, William T. Sherman, a man always sure of his views and eager to inflict them on others, turned to his superior officer, Ulysses S. Grant, and said, what we really need to do here is to call this off, to go back to Memphis, wait until the spring, and then march overland towards Vicksburg again. That our efforts to take the city have failed, and that to be stuck on the border between Arkansas and Louisiana for all winter is not exactly where we ought to be. And Grant turned to him and said, you know, there's a problem with this, and the problem is a very simple one. If we move back to Memphis, our movement is going to look like a retreat in the eyes of the Northern press. That's going to bring a lot of criticism upon us. And as you know, General Sherman, I have another Corps commander by the name of John McClernand, only too eager to take this command, who will point to this movement not as a retrograde movement, not simply as a fighting withdrawal, but as a pell-mell retreat, and use this to buttress his case to replace me as commander. What we have to do is take things as they are and understand how the public views what we do and move forward from there. Now, you know, people think of Ulysses S. Grant as someone unaware of the world of politics and public opinion, but I think here's a case where the general showed great insight into how the public viewed war, how readers of newspapers and letters from soldiers interpreted military movements, and of the importance of maintaining public support at critical moments in the war effort, understanding how the public interprets what happens on the battlefront. Now, over the last 2 decades, I'd argue there's been a tremendous literature about the home front, about life at home during the American Civil War, propelled by interest in women's history, social history, and the like. To the point, in fact, that sometimes I think a lot of people who grew up as Civil War historians wonder what these intruders are doing. Sometimes, in fact, they do claim that they are rescuing the Civil War as a historical subject from others. This literature has to do mainly with the Confederate front. Has to do largely with Southern women, largely Southern white women, largely Southern white women of middle to upper class status. Talks about the role of civilian support for the Confederate war effort, and as Herman knows, since he was a co-author, or in this was a 1/4 of an author of a book on this, and on why the South lost.
Let me tell you, that was 30-30-32.
Well, you're the quantifier.
We needed Bill Still to have credibility.
With the Navy folk. In any case, that talked about the issue of Confederate support on the civilian front for the Confederate war effort, to the degree to which that support lagged and proved insufficient in the end. There's been a large controversy about this approach to studying why the Confederacy lost. And of course, as we just heard earlier today, we also have a literature about what happens when battlefront and home front become one as soldiers approach the homestead. Well, that's a very interesting and vibrant literature, but it really tells us very little about what was going on in the North. What about the northern home front? I mean, with the exception of a few towns, like Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the war does not visit the North directly in the same way that it visits many places in the Confederacy. And how did events at home shape events at the front? How did events at the front shape events at home? And I point this out because I think today you have an artificial divide between different approaches to studying the Civil War, concentrating in home front and battlefront. What you really should understand here is this is a constant conversation between these two fronts. You can't understand what's going on the home front without understanding what's going on the battlefront, and you can't understand what's going on the battlefront unless you're taking a look at what's going on behind the lines. And that if you're going to understand war as a total experience in which American society was immersed between 1861 and 1865, you're going to have to look at it that way. You can't simply look at battles and leaders on one hand in isolation, and you can't look at the folks at home in isolation either. Something was going on which brought all these people together. They didn't make these artificial divisions. I have no earthly idea why some scholars persist in making them. So how did, first of all, the folks at home understand what was going on? After all, the South was seen as a different land, sometimes an exotic land. How did folks above the Ohio and the Potomac understand what's going on? Well, first of all, of course, we know that they got letters from soldiers describing the everyday life of the average enlisted soldier or officer. That a lot of these letters, in fact, while asking for news of home, are also talking about members of the community that are at the front, especially during the first several years of the war, where member companies are raised in communities. And so when someone's writing home, they're writing home about their neighbors who happen to be in the ranks now. And those letters contain some pungent commentary about officers, about political leaders, about how people at home understand or don't understand what's going on. They also contain broad descriptions of battles, although one of the things you come across as you look at soldiers' letters is they warn the people at home, I cannot describe what happened next. Or words would fail to encompass the experience of battle. That in a way it was a very segregating process. People who were in battle and people who weren't. And people who weren't in battle, so claimed the soldiers, could never understand what the experience of battle itself was like. But nevertheless, these letters home gave people at home some idea about what the soldiers thought about the various generals, military movements, prospects for success, the degree and determination of the Confederate opposition, and the like. So that's one source of information, what's going on, those letters. And I sometimes think we don't understand that enough. That's a primary source for the people at home. Another, and we've talked about this at various times in the historical literature, happen to be photographs. Photographs, by the way, taken with peculiar cultural sensibilities in mind. Now, you don't have photographs of Civil War battles. There are claims that there's a picture of the Battle of Antietam from far, far away, and all you see is mist, fog, and haze in the distance. But you don't have pictures of infantry in combat. We at most have a couple of photographs of an artillery battery going into action in Petersburg from far, far away with Matthew Brady watching on. What we do, in fact, have in contrast, especially, by the way, on the eastern battlefields, we don't have a lot of photographic history of the western battlefields at all. But the eastern battlefields would be the photographers who come on those fields after battles. And so, especially the terrain around Gettysburg, but there are also some hauntingly disturbing photos of Virginia in 1864 and 1865. And what's interesting about these photographs, from my point of view, is their desire to make violence look harmonious with nature and almost pastoral, because you have these dead bodies in open fields. And sometimes, in fact, and those who've gone to Gettysburg know about this, near Devil's Den, an active effort to pose dead bodies, the sharpshooter's last sweep, where they yanked the Confederate body, propped him against a wall, took a rifle, just an everyday common rifle, propped up next to him, said this guy was poking away at the Union officers in a little round top when he himself met his untimely demise. There was almost this romanticism. It's only if you look carefully at some of these photographs that you see dismembered body parts, for example, or the true violence that can happen to the human body from being hit by shot and shell. A lot of them just seem to be the soldier's last sleep, these quiet fields and the like. Now, as it was, the Civil War is the first photographed war, and when these photographs were taken home and put on exhibit and they were bought, they were quite interesting commercial items. We have descriptions of battle photographs from Antietam being displayed, and how Matthew Brady has brought the war home to people as much as possible. But even then, we don't have that same sort of experience. It's much more likely, in fact, that if you want to try to figure out what war looked like or a battle looked like, you'd have to go to the somewhat more curious representations of war in Currier and Ives prints, for example, where everyone's lined up and looks very neat and marching into battle. Both sides having great dry cleaning bills before each conflict. And the like. These would become even more sanitized after the war with the Kurtz and Allison prints, where everybody was really spiffy. I mean, you look at the Confederates in Kurtz and Allison prints in 1865, and they are really a handsome group of guys. And none of them are hungry, none of them are overweight reenactors either, but they're really good shape for an army that's beraggled and about to surrender. But these photographs gave people a partial image of what's going on in the aftermath of battle. Most likely, people understood what battle looked like and what was going on from articles that appeared in newspapers and in weekly journals such as Harper's Weekly, which had much more vivid etchings of the violence of battle. And that these newspaper articles would try to describe what was going on. Sometimes, by the way, very unsuccessfully. My favorite headline from a Civil War newspaper is, "Important if true." And if you follow how battles are covered in the newspapers, you'll be amazed, for example, how many times James Longstreet was killed during the Civil War. That all these generals die and then revive in a matter of hours. Sort of like hitting the reset button on a video game or something like that. The descriptions of battle often offered in the press were, shall we say, at variance with our current understanding of what happened. And yet you have to remember, at that time, that's what people saw as events unfold. Those are the reports they got. Someone made reference to 9/11. If you remember the press coverage as it evolved on the morning and early afternoon of 9/11, you might finally get some sense of what would be going on during the Civil War over the course of a week. That other installations were either attacked, that places were being evacuated, a widespread speculation as to what was going on, and then that story changing minute by minute as events developed. If you ever take a look back at the coverage on that fateful day provided by various commercial and cable news outlets, you'll see a story that expands wildly in ways that we now know weren't true at all. But anything was picked up by folks at that time, and And really, you know, in the moment, you can understand editorial judgment was not always the soundest. Same thing during the Civil War. You've got people coming back with dispatches that report victories when there are defeats, and defeats when later on there are victories. But all of this has a role to play in terms of how the public perceives how the war is going on. And these ups and downs sometimes are artificially inflicted by newspaper reports as opposed to an actual assessment of what's going on. Now, as these folks read these letters, looked at these pictures, perused these accounts, what's their frame of reference? Well, you know, we like to talk about the American Civil War as a modern war. There's been some dispute about the degree to which it deserves the label of a total war. But the fact of the matter is we forget to put ourselves in the mindset of a 19th century reader who is trying to make sense of these reports. To a 19th century reader, modern war was Waterloo. Modern generals were Frederick the Great and Napoleon and Wellington. And what people drew from that experience was a notion of war as characterized by a search for a big, decisive, climactic battle. That military campaigns were merely preludes to the great show, and that great show would be the battle. And that you understood victory and defeat in terms of the battle, capturing the opponent's cities, especially the opponent's capital. That's how you saw war. It was almost like a game of chess. If you capture the opponent's king, battle over. If you capture the opponent's capital, war over. Now that, I think, was odd, given that the Americans, in fact, had known that capitals had fallen without causes being lost. After all, the American Revolution had lost the U.S. Capitol several times. And it became sort of a, you know, capital on wheels after a while during the conflict, making stops at various places in the Middle Atlantic states. But in fact, people thought, gee, if they take the capital, that's it. If they take big cities, that's it. And of course, they will meet the opposing army, and there'll be a Waterloo. And this army will be knocked to pieces, and that's what we're looking for, the news of the great battle. You can see this in diaries and letters of people back home. We're waiting for news of the big battle. And that's why I would argue, for among other things, they didn't always understand things the way that we would like to understand them. Herman's pointed out the Vicksburg campaign. Well, the Vicksburg campaign is a campaign with a series of smaller battles in it, but there's no big battle. There's nothing that's going to attract your attention in quite the same way that a Gettysburg is going to attract your attention. There's no magnificent cyclorama of the siege of Vicksburg. But Gettysburg fits that sort of dramatic battle narrative. Antietam fits that dramatic battle narrative. And so that's what people thought modern war was at the time. You're waiting for the big bang, followed by the big surrender. And war's object is to achieve the big bang and take over cities. It's dramatic, it's romantic, it's daring. It's not a war against enemy resources. It's not a war of attrition. It doesn't involve the use of field fortifications or entrenchments. It's something dramatic and different and colorful. And that's how people are viewing the information they're getting. Those are their expectations. That's how they measure success and failure. Not through, let's say, the way that we today might measure success and failure in looking at the Civil War, which is, by the way, a lot different than how we measure success and failure in looking at current military operations. I've often pointed out to people who have been very critical of the Northern popular will and its flagging support for Reconstruction between 1865 and 1877, that by my calendar, we're in October 1865 when it comes to Iraq. And people want out already. So, and people have told me, well, what if we had news cameras and everything down in Reconstruction during 1865 and 1877? Wouldn't the the record of white supremacist terrorism have been enough to invigorate Northern morale. Well, we got news cameras now. And in fact, American military personnel is targeted now in ways that it was not targeted, at least white military personnel was not targeted during Reconstruction between 1865 and 1877. And you can see flagging will already. Oh, well, this is not what we want to do. We want to do something else. We want to go home. We're about the economy. You might be a little more generous towards white Americans between 1865 and 1877 if you'd make the same comparison. Same thing in terms of coverage of the war. I think a lot of people forget now that just before the rescue of Jessica Lynch, coverage of the war suggested that American forces had overreached, they'd gone too far, that this was going to become a military disaster. I had someone call up from the local newspaper and say, isn't this all like Vietnam? I said, no, this is going to be done in 2 or 3 weeks, and then the mess is going to begin, but the fighting's going to be pretty quick. What are you worried about? You're talking, and people talk about, look at those casualties. I said, yes, that's about half an hour on the morning of July 1, 1863. You know, get real. And so just as we might want to think about how we think of war now, these people in the 19th century thought of war in very classical Napoleonic ways in which we've been, questioning whether we should understand Civil War military operations that way. That's fine. But people at that time saw Frederick the Great and Napoleon as the icons of military genius. And in fact, I think the Lincoln administration realized this by 1864 because they started to practice a method of news control. Up till this time, there were reporters that came down the front, came to headquarters, and then tried to scurry back with reports of what was going on. And the administration decided in 1864 that the best thing to do was for the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, to send to New York, ostensibly to Major General John Dix in command at New York City, a report of the day's actions. And then Dix would release these reports to the Associated Press and other news outlets. And that's, if you look at your 1864 Civil War newspapers, that's what you've got, the latest dispatch from Secretary Stanton. And they tried to manage the news like that. And so you will find some very interesting reports coming from Secretary Stanton's pen about, like the minor skirmish at Cold Harbor, for example. And so the Lincoln administration and the generals that fought in blue have a problem during 1861 through 1865, and that's trying to educate perceptions of what they're doing. And they don't do, by the way, a very good job. And that's what Grant was talking about when he talks about if we move back to Memphis, it's going to look like a retreat, and we can't have that. And certainly I'd argue the best example of a conflict between war as we now understand it being waged and war as people perceived at the time is the Overland Campaign of 1864, Grant versus Lee. And if you take this from a very dispassionate point of view, what Grant does between May and early June 1864 is to take Lee out of the war, to pin the Confederates against Richmond and Petersburg where they really can't get out. As Lee himself would say, well, if they get south of the James, it'll become a siege, and then it'll just be a matter of time. But that's not how people at the time viewed the Overland Campaign. They had the promise of early success, the clash of titans, the Union's military genius Grant against the Confederate Goliath Lee. And then after 6 weeks, well, things didn't look quite so good. And people began to question the campaign and what was a failure or not. And public perceptions of what happens in 1864, if one of Grant's objectives in 1864 is to secure the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, then the Overland Campaign's a failure because not only it does influence public perception, but negatively, not positively towards the success of Union arms. So how do these perceptions play out? Let me give you a couple of examples here. In 1862, during the tail end of the 7 Days Battles, George McClellan, trying to work on security for his rear area during his elaborate, what he liked to call, change of base, went aboard the gunboat Galena during the Battle of Malvern Hill. Well, now, during the Civil War, the best place for a commanding general to be was behind the lines, trying to set things up, trying to move forces to the front. The worst place for a commanding general would be in the front lines. But because people's perception was that the general should be under fire, sharing the trials and travails of his soldiers, McClellan's being on the gunboat Galena was forever a stigma that he was a coward, that he was unwilling to accept the same fate that might befall his men. And for example, this would be used in 1864 as a powerful campaign cartoon against McClellan. It'd even be used when McClellan ran for governor in New Jersey in the 1880s. They'd revive this idea of the coward McClellan. Now, whatever you think of George McClellan, and I don't necessarily think that he was a wonderful, brilliant, or courageous fellow, he was doing what he was supposed to be doing. He's at the rear lines. That's where generals are supposed to be. It was very nice that during the Gulf War that Norman Schwarzkopf decided to wear fatigues. After all, given his figure, they were enhancing. But it was irrelevant. What are you going to do, camouflage yourself behind your PC? Not how it works. Didn't matter what he wore. He could have wore a jogging outfit. It's not important. And unlike Grant at Appomattox, he made sure that the cameras came up for the Armistice conference right at the end of the ground war, so he could be pictured going up to accept surrenders and arrange for a ceasefire. Look at Gettysburg. One of the reasons I think we're all captured by Gettysburg in terms of our imagination, it is a dramatic battle. It is exciting. You could make a movie out of it. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at what did Gettysburg really achieve, the answer is nothing, other than 51,000 casualties. What Gettysburg proved is what Antietam had proved the previous year. Both sides win at home. Who's going to break that stalemate? Who's going to steal a critical game in enemy territory? Maybe Roger Clemens, huh? But in this case, the fact is Lee's escape rendered the reputation of the battle uncertain. One of the most interesting things is to read northern newspapers about Gettysburg in the fall and winter of 1863 as Congress begins to investigate. By 1864, many Northerners began to believe that Gettysburg was a great lost opportunity. And that it wasn't, they didn't think of it as the turning point of the American Civil War. They did not think of it as the high tide of the Confederacy. That's something that comes later for various reasons that we can discuss at another time. In fact, what made Gettysburg any more important than any other battle in the East was simply that Lincoln came there in November and tried to talk about what the battle meant. And he was trying, in fact, to give an interpretation of the battle in terms of the larger Union war effort. But even then, he didn't say, and you can read the Gettysburg Address for proof of this, he doesn't say Gettysburg's the turning point of the war. In fact, he speaks repeatedly the unfinished business before us, the unfinished work, that we still have things to do. That, in fact, if we don't continue this war, these men shall have died in vain. So he doesn't see Gettysburg as being it, he just says a battlefield, not the battlefield. One of the things about the way the press was shaped and the media, and that's basically all the media is the press in 1861, 1865. There aren't cameras or anything else. There aren't cable networks. There's no Wolf Blitzer. There's a concentration on things Eastern. That given the close location of the Union Confederate capitals, given the congregation of so many press outlets in the East, in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Washington, people concentrated on the East, and that happened to be where the great dramatic battles were, certainly throughout 1861 through 1863. That's why you see a lot, and even the Northern press, reflections on the greatness of Lee, Jackson, Stuart. They're dashing, they're sensational, they're Napoleonic in many ways. If you read Eastern newspapers, you have very little idea what's going on in the West. There's a vast ignorance. There is this sort of sense that history ends at the Appalachian mountain chain for these folk, and that things evolve much more slowly, and people really don't know what's going on. The West becomes somewhat of a mystery to many Eastern correspondents, but even some of the Midwestern papers in Chicago and Cincinnati, for example, are as much Eastern-oriented as are their Eastern-based counterparts. Well, one thing we all see is that a lot of generals and privates, and commissioned and non-commissioned soldiers alike, complain about public perceptions of what happens in combat as relayed to the public through the press. The most famous, I would argue, would be the Whitlaw-Reid report of the Battle of Shiloh, where Reid comes up behind and sees all this chaos and disorder. Grant would later on point out the worst place from which to judge the progress of a battle is from the rear. But it was Reid's report of Shiloh more than anything else that established it as a terrifying surprise where the Union was lucky to escape by the narrowest of margins. There's a lot about Shiloh press coverage that's worthy of examination because this is one of the few battles in which generals felt compelled to write to counter reports of what had happened. William T. Sherman, no friend of newspaper reporters, for example, got into a newspaper war with the lieutenant governor of Ohio, a man named Benjamin Stanton. Grant himself wrote a letter that his father incautiously allowed to be reproduced in a local Cincinnati newspaper. Grant and the Cincinnati Press did not get along at all. And so you've got generals writing articles and letters countering the reports that they're finding in the newspapers, even as other generals begin to figure out in 1862 and 1863 that the best way to get good press coverage is to curry the favor of reporters. Now, some were more successful at this than others. William T. Sherman was clearly not successful at this, and that's why in early 1863 he actually had a reporter, Thomas Knox, of the New York Herald, tried as a spy for some inaccurate but colorful reporting of his campaigns against Vicksburg. Grant, on the other hand, understanding how the world worked in a much more sophisticated way, began to befriend certain reporters, the most famous of which, of course, is Sylvanus Cadwallader of the Chicago Times, which was actually a Democratic paper in Chicago, and then later on the New York Herald. And Cadwallader made sure to give the general very favorable press coverage in his published columns. Other Union generals were aware of the impact of the press and sometimes felt the wrath of the press. In June 1864, just after Cold Harbor, both Ambrose Burnside and George Meade became furious with newspaper reporters. And so as Grant is pointing to cross the James in this decisive strike of the Overland campaign, he has to deal with the fact that two of his generals want to shoot reporters. And in fact, Burnside and Meade seemed much more eager to shoot reporters than they were to attack Lee, mainly because the target was easier. And in one of these cases, the newspapers retaliated by deciding not to mention Meade's name in dispatches anymore. And so Meade became this sort of vanished figure for a while. The Army moved. Who told it to? Well, someone did. But Meade sort of disappears, and Meade was quite upset about this, told his wife that his feelings were hurt, and, you feel sorry for the old snapping turtle after a while. Newspaper editors like to place pressure on generals. They like to write political figures. Cincinnati editors, for example, Merritt Halstead. Halstead wrote in 1863 about how Grant was a drunken fool. This was right before the Vicksburg campaign, that Grant was a poor stick when he was sober, and he was drunk over half the time. He wrote this to Salmon Chase, who gave it to Lincoln after Grant takes Vicksburg. Of course, Chase wrote Grant a very nice letter saying how he, the Secretary of the Treasury, had always been on Grant's side. If there was nothing, Salmon Chase is the definition of elusive and flexible. No wonder he's named after a fish. But newspaper editors thought that they were, in fact, policy players in this regard, but in a much more open way than now. I mean, they just wrote, and they said, this is what we think, and this is what you ought to do, and if you don't do it, we'll turn against your guy. Joseph Medill of the Chicago Tribune, for example, wrote Elihu Washburn, who was Grant's sort of political patron in Congress, and said, your man Grant is played out. If you don't see what's going on there, we'll turn against him. So there's very much a notion that the press knew that it had a control of perceptions and was willing to twist as much as possible to get its way by using that control of perceptions. And again, as I'd say, this is most critical in my mind. You can see these things all come together in the campaigns of 1864. That when Grant came east in March 1864, he did not care to stay east. He didn't care much for Washington. He didn't care much for the lifestyle there. But as he and other staff officers began to realize it was important in the public imagination that Lee and Grant face each other head to head. That it would be unsatisfactory if Grant went west. That people were looking for that clash of titans. And I think it's terribly important because when Grant goes to war in 1864 in Virginia, it's with an army that's never fought with him, with officers whose abilities he does not know. This is an entirely new army to him, and he's got to face Robert E. Lee with an army with which he's totally unfamiliar. Grant's army in 1864 is the Army of the Tennessee under the command now of William T. Sherman. Grant's army was never the Army of the Potomac in thought, word, or deed, as many of the officers of the Army of the Potomac have been only too eager to inform readers. So Grant's got to fight a war with one hand tied behind his back, so to speak, in terms of these are tools he's not familiar with, these are men he doesn't know what they can and for that matter cannot do. And he's got to have this head-to-head clash in Virginia. Well, the newspapers, of course, play this up as the war is going to end in 48 hours. Once those two armies make contact, Grant is going to steamroller over Lee. It's all over. And you read these reports anticipating that in the next 24 hours, news of a decisive Union victory is going to come. And it doesn't happen. There's battle, and then another battle. And then there's news of an imminent Union success, and then we find out that both armies are moving again. And so what the press had done was set up an expectation for a first-round knockout, and what people were looking for was a Waterloo, and what they were getting with a small m was a marathon. A long, drawn-out struggle with no end in sight, marked only by the ever-lengthening casualty lists that appeared in the papers. So those initial high hopes for success, the expectations game people talk about in politics, those had given way to this long drawn-out campaign. No one went to the press and said, you know, the way to fight Lee is to fight him every day and night. That this war of attrition will eventually wear out the Confederates. That pinning Lee against Richmond and Petersburg means the eventual fall of the Confederate capital unless Lee can pull a rabbit out of a hat. That Early's operation up the Shenandoah Valley and towards Washington, down the Shenandoah and towards Washington, was in fact, hey, you know, that's a distraction that we should be able to deal with rather handily if we choose to do so. That wasn't the perception. The perception was that the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James were bogged down opposite Richmond and Petersburg, and that Grant had been used up like all of his predecessors. So by the summer of 1864, the Northern public did not see what was going on in Virginia as a stranglehold. They saw it as another stalemate. And there was no effort to change perceptions of that. Okay, what changes public attitudes? The capture of a city and a series of dramatic victories. When William T. Sherman's army enters Atlanta in September 1864, it's an astonishingly incomplete victory. The Confederate Army of Tennessee under John Bell Hood escapes to fight another day and be destroyed by its commander. But Hood escapes. Sherman's directive at the beginning of the campaign was to destroy the Army of Tennessee. Sherman was never good at destroying any armies. We remember Sherman for his marches, but there are no great Sherman battlefields. And that's because whatever you think of Sherman's genius in terms of making war, he was not a terribly skilled battlefield tactician. Atlanta was already out of the war. In encircling it and putting it under siege, Sherman had removed it effectively as an important part of the Confederate arsenal. All you're doing on September 2nd is walking into an evacuated city. But how do people measure success? Taking cities. We've got one. Now what happens the following month? First of all, about 2.5 weeks later, and then a month after that, 2 sensational military victories in the Shenandoah Valley by Philip Sheridan. And especially the second, the Battle of Cedar Creek, with Sheridan 20 miles away, even though that's not quite an accurate measurement, coming down and rescuing his army after a surprise attack by Jubal Early. That was dramatic. That was the stuff of which there are portraits and statues.
And poems.
And Thomas Reed's poem. It was lovely. Again, you don't have the poem of Cold Harbor, but you have the poem of Sheridan's Ride, and you have the drama of Sherman taking Atlanta. Those met the traditional criteria for measuring victory in the minds of the Northern public. Not the modern war that Grant was conducting in Virginia, but rather the traditional war being waged in the end, oddly enough, by Sherman, often seen as the father of modern war, one of its fathers, and Sheridan, who basically gave the North a Union equivalent to Jeb Stuart in his actions in the Shenandoah Valley. What Sheridan was actually doing in the valley was much more mundane. Just being there was good enough. Burning the valley, that wasn't romantic, but that battle at Cedar Creek, that capped the case, just as much as Winchester and the taking of Winchester the month before had electrified the Union public. So these battles became military successes, not just because of what they achieved, because I think you can really qualify the extent to which Atlanta, Winchester, and Cedar Creek were spectacular military victories on their own merits, but you can't take them outside the public perception that greeted the news of these Union victories, that they met traditional notions of victory and defeat. And it's those actions, fitting as they do in a Napoleonic framework of interpreting battlefield operations, and not the much more grinding warfare practiced in Virginia, that end up reinvigorating Northern support after a summer of war weariness and help propel the Lincoln administration to re-election and the Union to victory in 1864-65. This game of public perceptions, which I think we're playing again right now in terms of American policy overseas, is a critical part. It's one of the places where you do bring home front and battlefront together. And we're not going to understand the American Civil War until we merge these things together much more successfully to reach a better, deeper, and richer understanding of that conflict. Thank you. Now I'll take questions. Yes?
Would you have to throw in the Battle of Mobile Bay?
Traditionally you would think so. But oddly enough, that doesn't receive quite the newspaper coverage that I thought it would. It becomes romantic later on because of the damn the torpedoes. Yes. But Mobile Bay actually occurs, remember, on August 5th, 1864, and 19 days later, Lincoln's writing that memorandum saying, or 18 days later, on the 23rd, he's writing that memo saying, it's all over, I'm going to lose.
They didn't take Mobile, the city.
Yeah, they did. So Mobile doesn't fall until April 1865.
April 10th.
Yeah.
There was an odd thing going on with volunteer regiments in the North that didn't occur in the South. And I was wondering if you run across this in public perception, that volunteer regiments in the North were mustered out of service when people's enlistments were up.
Right.
Not served for the duration. And so in 1864, you've got a flood of of soldiers physically returning home in the North. And even the ones who re-enlist, they get their furlough. They get to spend a couple months at home before they go back into the veteran. Do you see like any indication of influence of just all these people showing up back in Boston, for example, and talking to people?
You see the people who furloughed in order to reinvigorate their units would be furloughed in the winter, actually. So a lot of the furloughing goes back in the winter and they come back in the spring. What you do have is what I call the great re-enlistment crisis of 1864, because half of the soldiers re-enlist. And there are people like Reed Mitchell make a big deal about this. Okay, well, that's the glass is half full. My glass on this one is half empty. And what you find is that one of the major sources of attrition in the Army of the Potomac in 1864 are expiring enlistments. And with time running short, how well do you think these soldiers fight? When you know that you're going to be home in 2 weeks, you've got problems. All right, and a lot of these units go, and they're pulled out of line because they know they're going to go. Oliver Wendell Holmes, a Massachusetts hero, would later on talk about how our hearts were touched by fire, with fire at this time. You read what he says in 1864 when he's a staff officer in 6th Corps. He doesn't stay. He leaves in 1864. He says, I've had enough. Let somebody else do this. They come home, and they are mixed because, on one hand, the ones that do come home, they felt they've done what they had to do. They're not wild about having McClellan as the next president, though, because that really would make things... There's a resentment not of McClellan. There's some amusement about McClellan's positions, but a real hatred of the Democrats. As much as they may not be happy with Lincoln or Grant, they really do not like the Democrats calling the war a failure, because that really does call into question what they were about. And so, but no one's actually done a study of the former soldier vote for, I think, obvious reasons, as opposed to the soldier vote, that there's a veteran vote in 1864 of people back home. It's not been as explored as some other aspects of that campaign. Yeah.
The comparison of Grant and Sherman's style of fighting, Grant's trench warfare at Petersburg, some have compared it as a precursor to World War I trench warfare, where Sherman with movement capturing of the big cities is like World War II, with taking a Paris overall. Do you think there's something to that? And today, World War I is not very popular to study, whereas World War II is wildly popular.
Well, I think there's been, what's interesting is the degree to which the military has latched on to Grant and Sherman as models of modern warfare in ways that Grant and Sherman would have found somewhat curious. The siege of Richmond and Petersburg, after all, is not a very good siege. It's two armies facing each other in trench lines, but the Confederates are getting their supplies, and basically the Army of Potomac and the Army of James don't have enough men to make it an encirclement. Had we been encircled, that'd been it. But in fact, the story of that siege is stretching those lines and trying to cut off supply lines. This was not a kind of war that Grant welcomed. It was one that was more or less forced on him by the situation. What Grant had to confront, though, that is different than what Sherman had to confront, is that Grant had to confront Robert E. Lee, who was a slightly more intelligent general than either Joe Johnston or John Bell Hood. Sherman was blessed. Sherman preferred movement. Johnston accommodated him. They did a little waltz all the way from Chattanooga to the outskirts of Atlanta. One step forward, one step back. I'll cooperate here, you cooperate there. I'll fight someday, sure you will. Boom, boom, boom. The one blip on that being Kennesaw Mountain, which convinced everybody we don't want to do that again. Then when the Confederates are in Atlanta and need to save every possible soldier to fortify that area and to man those trenches, John Bell Hood comes on the scene and says, well, I'm going to attack several times. Yeah. I mean, that's a blessing. If Grant only had Lee attack him multiple times at Richmond and Petersburg, Grant would give his men, his commanders orders, go out, be vulnerable, invite an attack. If we can get them out of their trenches, we'll clobber them. Lee never obliged. Had Hood been in command at Richmond and Petersburg, Grant would have been in there in September.
Sure. Richard McMurray's Pond Martin Reed act as if Johnston had not been relieved?
Well, the story of Johnson and Grant had been fighting in 1864, as Grant originally had. The siege that would have taken a week in 1864 would have been the siege of Key West.
Yeah, the Confederate, the dramatic Confederate amphibious evacuation of Key West.
And but on the other hand, the other part of that is if Sherman had gone east, he would have attacked Washington to shut up all the reporters and politicians. So, you know, it would have been a bad story either way.
I think Sherman was overjoyed when John Bell Hood was appointed. I believe he sent the telegram to Grant or Lincoln stating that Jefferson Davis is the best Union general we've ever had by making that move.
But in all fairness, I mean, from the Confederate perspective, what were you supposed to do? That's a cultural imperative, or are you just going to allow yourself to retreat and retreat and retreat?
In retrospect, maybe the waltz that Johnson and Sherman, at least that, like you said yourself, John Bell Hood destroyed the Southern Army. I also would like to say that the Southern press was very influential when they, like the Atlanta press, for instance, said that Sherman will never take Atlanta. And I think Lincoln got a hold of the newspapers and the Southern press compared Atlanta to Napoleon going into Russia. And Lincoln replied, well, who's gonna...
Well, it comes a little afterwards. I know what you're talking about. What after Atlanta falls, Jefferson Davis, after both Atlanta and later when Richmond falls, he goes out speaking after Atlanta, and then right after Richmond falls, he issues a proclamation, and he sees, by the way, the fall of these cities as liberating experiences for the Confederate Army, because now we're going to be able to do other things that we haven't been able to do before. But he does talk about, now that Sherman's in the middle of Georgia, it will be like Napoleon's advance into Russia in 1812, and it's Grant who says that Mr. Davis has not made clear who is to provide snow in this case.
Well, and in that vein, that's why I think the Lincoln administration deserves credit for always understanding that it is the destruction of the Confederate armies that is really what...
Yeah, but I think there are two things that are interesting about the way things are playing at that point. First of all, the Napoleonic comparison that Davis draws, I think, reminds us of where their points of reference were. But second, when Grant and Lee are around Richmond and Petersburg and spring turns to fall, what Grant decides to do, by the way, is not to launch any serious offensives, because once news of Atlanta and Winchester and Cedar Creek come, he basically says, we're now ahead. I'm not going to do anything to mess up public perception of what's going on. And there are several offensive attempts that sort of peter out, and boy, have they played quietly in the press. Grant also made sure that Sherman would not commence his march to the sea until after Election Day. So Sherman does not commence the march to the sea until mid-November, November 15, because they want to play it safe. The great bankruptcy to me in Confederate strategic thought is between the fall of Atlanta and the election of 1864. The Confederates, knowing what's at stake, cannot produce any result to stem the tide of applause in favor of Lincoln's reelection. And I think one of the important things about the election of 1864, remember, Lincoln wins 55% to 45%, and people are all in the electoral vote. He creams McClellan. But that means out of every 20 voters, if one person changes their mind, you've got a dead heat. That's after Mobile Bay, after Atlanta, after Winchester, after Cedar Creek. So that meant as of November 1864, after all of that, 45% of the eligible electorate still thought George McClellan would make a better president than Abraham Lincoln. And that might suggest that this was a little more of a close-run thing. I know Herman and I both have colleagues who talk about that Atlanta wasn't important. Oh, well, you know, everyone then thought it was important. And certainly Lincoln, who himself had prophesied electoral defeat a week before the fall of Atlanta, thought it was critically important. Other questions? Yeah.
When are we gonna see the second half of your grant biography?
I would say 6 to 8 months after I finish it. Which will be when I'm done. I've learned never to predict these things because you'd be foolish. And so, and you just set up your own expectations game, which you're destined to disappoint one way or
Some
another.
of us work in spurts, you know, we go for a good long while, and we don't get anything done, and then all of a sudden, boy, we just pour out a lot.
Anything else? Yes?
In the southern arena, the emphasis of the media in the north is clear and obvious. In the south, what role did it play? How did it reflect or not, or was it insignificant?
Well, first of all, there's a problem in the South with the circulation of newspapers. But one place where I'd argue the media was actually fairly influential was around Richmond, because Edward Pollard and others kept up a drumbeat of criticism of the Davis administration. And you knew that at least, while maybe people, you know, in Jackson, Mississippi didn't get the Richmond papers, the people in Richmond got the Richmond papers. And so you have a lot of people becoming more and more unhappy about the progress of the war in Richmond proper. You know, you had the bread rise, for example, in March 1863, that there was, in fact, a great deal of discontent, and feeding off that discontent among members of the Confederate Congress. So it became much like we call about inside the Beltway politics today. Pollard's criticism of the Davis administration sort of fed on a growing disillusion with the Confederate president, and made life, I think, very difficult for Davis. And Davis didn't really have the ways to deal with the press that Lincoln did. He wouldn't do like Lincoln would make sure to offer James Gordon Bennett, the editor of the New York Herald, a post as minister to France in 1864, knowing full well that Bennett would decline it, but be immensely flattered. And the Herald was a much more widely read paper than we tend to recall at that